Hey guys, this is Khavrion here with another battle report. This is going to be another in my series of adventures trying out Tohaa, and as I mentioned in my previous battle report, I have felt that a lot of the games that I've been playing with Tohaa have been not that interesting. However, it occurred to me as I sat down to try to do a battle report on the IGL Season 6 Finals match, a game which I do think is interesting and I do want to talk about, that the reason I have been finding my games to be not that interesting is itself an interesting topic that is worthy of making a battle report. So this is going to be the second Tohaa battle report for a game that I wouldn't normally make a battle report about, except to discuss why the games that I've been playing with Tohaa have, in my opinion, been not that interesting. And hopefully this will help provide you with some context for what you see in the finals game against Lobo, and also what I am trying to do with my lists, and also what I've been experiencing with Tohaa. I will endeavor to keep this one short, both for my time and for your time, but we'll see how it goes. Anyway, let's get started. The mission for IGL Season 6 Round 4 was Neural Net. This is a custom mission by VolSC, and it is the quintessential button push mission. There is a 3x3 grid of terminals, all of which are in the midfield like seen here, and the only source of victory points in this game is controlling terminals by having a specialist walk up and push a button on the terminal. You get 1 point per terminal that you control at the end of the game, and you get 1 more point if you control more terminals than your adversary. So far, pretty straightforward. Onto this, we do have a couple more rules. First, as with most but not all button push missions, only one player can capture a terminal at a time. So if you push a button that your opponent controls, you take control away from them. Second, there is the encryption rule. At the start of the game, each player is going to secretly record one of the 9 terminals. And except for some pretty rare circumstances, which we'll get to in a second, that terminal cannot be taken by their opponent. This is done in secret, and it is only revealed after the opponent has successfully passed a whip roll in order to push the button. So as an example, let's say the middle terminal is the one that I have designated to be encrypted, and my opponent walks a gangbuster in silhouette contact and makes a whip roll. Let's say my opponent fails the first time, nothing is revealed, he just loses the order. And then let's say he spends another order and on the second roll he passes. At the moment that he has passed, I then reveal that actually the center console is the one that I have encrypted, so that whip roll is treated as if it fails because it was encrypted. And that encryption is going to last unless a player controls every single other terminal. So in this example, my opponent would have to control every single other terminal except the middle one before they would be able to capture the middle one. If that sounds hard to you, well, it also sounds hard to me. I've never seen anyone control all 8 of the other ones, which means I've never seen anyone get the full 10 points for this mission. And it basically means that in practice, encryption is a terminal that your opponent can't push the button on. Even so, I think encryption adds a lot of complexity to the game. You might go for something simple and try to just block a terminal that your opponent has obviously easy access to. Or maybe you're going first and you're worried that your opponent is going to try to steal one of the terminals that you've pushed, and so you put encryption on that one to protect it. Or maybe you're going first and you have a specialist right next to a terminal and you think your opponent is blocking that terminal, so you don't try to push the button on it at all, and then in fact your opponent was playing some other double bluff, etc., etc. Suffice it to say that the encryption mechanic is pretty straightforward, and it seems a little gimmicky, especially because of the fact that, you know, in practice you're never going to push the encrypted terminal unless things are going really, really well for you. But it does add a lot of complexity to an otherwise relatively straightforward game. However, it is the third addition that I think adds the most complexity to this, which is machine learning. Basically, I think in the context of this mission, there's an AI living in the 9 terminals, and as the game goes on, the AI gets smarter and is thus better able to resist the button pushes. In practice, what this means is that whip rolls get a +3 mod on the first turn of the game, they get no mod on the second turn of the game, and they get a -3 roll on the third turn of the game. I believe the intent of this rule is twofold. First, it is to incentivize players to push buttons on the first turn of the game. Because it's easier to push buttons early on, you really want to do that on the first turn. However, every order that you spend pushing buttons is an order that you do not spend trying to kill someone, which in turn means that the machine learning part of this mission is gently pushing the players away from an alpha strike strategy and towards actually doing the mission on turn 1, which I think is pretty nice. And the second intent of this is to make it so the mission is not all about going second and then pushing lots of buttons during the last turn of the game. In some other missions, like Acquisition, there is this degenerate strategy where you intentionally go second, and then you don't do anything except try to survive for the entirety of the mission, and then at the very last second, you have guys reveal from hidden deployment or combat drop or whatever, and they only have to push a couple of consoles and deal a little bit of damage, and your opponent is completely, shit out of luck. Now, the player going second can still steal consoles from the opponent, and that is going to be an important part of their play if they are going second. But because you have this -3 mod, it's really unreliable to try to push a whole bunch of buttons on the last turn and just kind of hope that you're going to succeed enough to steal the game from your opponent. So I think those are the design intents for the machine learning rule. In practice, I actually do think it works a lot of the time. As we will see in this game and other games that I've played, I tend to like to push a lot of buttons when I go first. I also tend to get very stressed if I haven't pushed enough buttons as I get towards the later turns of the game. That being said, I absolutely have done missions of Neural Net in which I spend the entirety of my time alpha striking my opponent into the dirt. This is especially true if I can kill all their specialists. And if that kind of thing happens, it is just an alpha strike approach. And, I think that's also probably fine. infiNity is fundamentally a game about shooting people, so having a viable strategy of shoot your opponent really, really hard, that's good too. Anyway, those are the 3 added twists to this mission that VolSC put in when he originally designed the mission. There is, however, one extra twist that was added for IGL Season 6 specifically. I could not for the life of me find where they actually posted this rule, but I could find enough records in the Discord of the discussions I had on this to know that the skill was called Concentration, and that the way that it worked is that basically if you had failed a whip roll on the immediate previous order, then you could take a long skill to automatically pass the whip roll. And the design intent of this is straightforward enough. It's not hard to imagine a game of Neural Net in which you are winning, and all you have to do is push 1 or 2 buttons on the last turn of the game, and you're going to win the whole game, and you're just failing die roll after die roll after die roll. At face value, this moment feels strongly non-interactive. I mean, it's not like either you or your opponent in that moment are doing anything other than watching the dice get rolled. And whether you win or lose, it's easy to imagine that it feels really bad for a burst 1 die roll to be the deciding factor of all this stuff. And I believe it is in the context of trying to mitigate some of this basically bald randomness, bald luck, that the tournament organizers for IGL Season 6 decided to add in this concentration skill as an intended mitigation of the bad luck. Unfortunately, I do not like this addition at all. I found both in theory before I played my game and in practice after I played my game that the fear of failing to make your whip rolls again and again and again is one of the major reasons why you're incentivized to push buttons early. I mean, plenty of infiNity players are keenly aware that a burst 1 roll, especially a burst 1 roll at -3, is something that can be failed again and again and again, and we will spend a lot of effort trying to avoid being in the circumstance where the game hinges on those single rolls. Second, I don't think this rule does all that much to change the sort of luck-based nature of that 3rd turn of Neural Net. I mean, sure, it can happen that you fail again and again and again when you're trying to make these rolls, but it can also happen that you pass every single whip roll that you make. I played a different game of Neural Net in the Team Battle Cultstorm event where my Fusilier paramedic, Whip 12, passed every single button push he attempted throughout the entire game, and he made like 5. Sure, some of those were at +3, some of those were on flats, but at least one of them was at -3, and getting lucky and passing every single button roll definitely affected the game. I believe it affected the game just as much as having failed again and again and again on the 3rd turn would have affected the game. Now, that was a different game of Neural Net that I'm talking about, and that game did not feature the concentration long skill, but it helps to prove the point that being able to spend a long skill after you've failed the roll may feel like it is getting rid of the chance for you to get unlucky, but in practice, it just makes the game about who gets lucky instead. And in this game, I basically only used the concentration skill on turn 2 in order to guarantee that I could push a button when I had previously failed it. So yeah, all in all, I'm not a fan of the concentration addition to Neural Net, and the tournament organizers for IGL 6 evidently felt similarly because I think they got rid of it and don't intend to add it again. I will say, if you really felt like it was absolutely necessary to add in a mechanic in some capacity to compensate for the fact that it's only burst 1, then I might recommend something to do with command tokens. Maybe you can spend a command token to re-roll a failed whip roll. And that way there is at least some interactivity here because you and your opponent have been spending command tokens throughout the entire game, but maybe you chose to save your command tokens because you wanted to have that extra guarantee of extra die rolls. And the command token reroll thing was featured in a previous ITS season in N3, where a forward observer, who was your O12 liaison officer, had to make a whip roll at the end of the game, and you could use command tokens to reroll that. So we have some precedent for re-rolling on command tokens in objectives, and of course we have the precedent of cubes and doctors and remote presence and engineers. But honestly, I don't think you need it. I don't think that it does anything really to shift the balance of the game, and I don't think it makes the game better. Neural Net is great. It is absolutely the most balanced mission that Volasi has designed, and I think it is a wonderful addition to infiNity competitive play. And I'm really happy that Corvus Belli has officially endorsed custom missions in ITS events. So, that wraps up our discussion of the missions. And so let's talk about lists. This is, again, a very rough approximation of my opponent's list. I believe I have covered all the core pieces, but I don't really remember what the groups are, and as you can see, I didn't quite get the points right. Nevertheless, I think we are going to see the broad strokes of what my opponent brought, and it will be enough for us to talk about the game. My opponent was Estugon, who is an excellent player, but he is playing O12, which is not an excellent faction. The broad consensus among highly competitive infiNity players seems to be that O12 is a pretty well-designed faction in the sense that none of their units are standout, bonkers, or broken or anything like that. As someone who played O12 in late N3, I can say that pieces like the Gamma and the Alpha unit are fun, but they are fairly expensive for what they provide, and I don't think that they are particularly overpowered. Since N3, a lot of profiles have been added, most notably the Lawkeeper, but I still think that O12 as a faction is relatively tame and not that overpowered. This is especially true when you compare it with what I'm playing, which is Tohaa, which is janky and custom and kind of bullshit in a lot of ways. All that said, let's go ahead and talk about this list because I think it's got a lot of the good pieces that I would take if I were making an O12 list. First off, we have 3 Varangians. These are the regular impetuous warbands of O12. They have smoke grenades, they have direct template weapons, they have some melee skill, and what distinguishes the O12 version of the warband from other versions of the warbands is that Varangians are a little bit on the expensive side because of their higher armor and higher durability through the special skill Dogged. They also pay a premium for guns like the submachine gun and heavy pistol, and in my opinion, they suffer for lack of a good close combat weapon and a good close combat skill. They only have Berserk and the AP CCWs. It is more than a little sad that O12's best and only warband is available in Cosmo with 2 profiles that O12 would love to have, the 9-point cheap version and the 13-point version that has a trench hammer. Alas, these 2 Cosmo exclusive profiles are not available in O12, and so we are left with the ones that you see here. I'm not sure if he took the 12-point ones or the 13-point ones that trade the chain rifle for the chain colt +1 burst, but ultimately it's essentially the same creature with the same strengths and the same weaknesses. Next up is the Gamma. This guy is an armor 6, BTS 6, 2 wound, NWI, absolute chonk of a unit. He's got BS 14, a heavy machine gun with an extra burst, and he clocks in at the startlingly low price of 53 points. This dude brings with him the durability of the Gecko tag from Nomads with a long-range gun that the Gecko would absolutely love to have. And because he's got NWI, you can actually cancel his last wound and cure him while taking advantage of his cube, which is again something that the Gecko can't do. I rocked this guy a ton when I was playing O12 at the end of N3, and he got a little bit cheaper in the transition from N3 to N4, which of course makes him better. Now, I believe my opponent did take the HMG version, which can struggle if an opponent brings armored targets that he needs to hammer through like a tag, but in a matchup against Tohaa, the HMG is going to be perfectly serviceable. Of course, the only downside to the Gamma is that it is a lot of points tied up in one unit, which was really only good at, doing this one specific job, and he won't be able to get into my guts and really start digging me out with that HMG. Next up on here is one of the 2 Lynxes that Estugon brought. Now, I've played Estugon in the past. Specifically, I've played against him with O12, and I did recall that he liked taking these hidden deployment guys. I don't think there's anything particularly special about them. They're roughly equivalent to Hexas from Pan-Oceania. They start in your deployment zone, they're in hidden deployment, they've got a sniper rifle. And this particular Lynx, my opponent revealed it when in fact he didn't have line of fire. I believe I told him he could put it back into hidden deployment because, fair's fair. But the fact of the matter is that from that moment on, I knew where his Lynx was and was able to avoid its line of fire until I, basically didn't avoid its line of fire. That whoopsie meant that the Lynx couldn't surprise me through the course of the game, but the fact of the matter is that it's just a Lynx. It's only got a multi-sniper rifle. This isn't a Noctifer or anything like that, and hidden deployment sniper rifles aren't terribly effective at doing all that much. Not bad by any stretch of the imagination. I would say it is perfectly serviceable, but it's also not busted and excellent either. In that sense, the Lynx multi-sniper is very representative of O12 as a faction. Next up are the two gangbusters. I actually do think these guys are really, really good. They start in the midfield with their mad traps. They have the killer hacking devices, which both makes them specialists and allows them to marker up if you want to, and of course allows them to killer hacker any, hacking device that runs around. And they also come packing with both MSV1 and Mimetism -3. I think these are a great combination of units, and they're really well chosen in a button-pushing mission like Neural Net. If I had one complaint, it's that they don't come with marker state, which can make them very vulnerable on the first turn of the game until they've had a chance to cybermask up. And well, yes, Morans and Nomads don't have marker state and are awesome. Morans and Nomads are coming with a repeater, so you can hack, or you can take a boarding shotgun profile, so you can drop a template on the other guy, and in that sense, they can at least trade with some capacity for whatever runs up. Not so with the Gangbusters. They've only got the SMG and the Mad Traps, and that does make them vulnerable until they can marker up. Still a good pick, and I remember taking two of these guys every single time I played O12. Next up was Liang Kai. Liang Kai deserves some attention here. He is a 1 wound, no wound in cap, but not shock immune monstrosity in close combat who has stealth and super jump. What this means is that Liang Kai is my opponent's best tool for dealing with my tackle wolves. Everything else in my opponent's list is at serious risk of getting either deleted or isolated because of my Ferroware. Because of his stealth, Liang Kai can get close, and because of his extreme dangerousness in close combat, he can actually finish off my dudes. However, he is shock vulnerable, which means that anything in my list that drops down a shock mine is potentially existentially threatening to Liang Kai, and all the viral that I'm packing is likewise existentially threatening to Liang Kai. Indeed, both me and my opponent were intimately aware that Liang Kai was his best tool for taking stuff out, and something like the first turn of the game, Liang Kai loses a face-to-face with Jan Star, takes a hit from the viral pistols, fails one of the two saves, and dies. The loss of that face-to-face is actually a big part of why I consider this game to be uninteresting. A not that unfair summary of this game was, my opponent didn't bring anything that could handle Fairware except for Liang Kai, and Liang Kai died before he could do anything. Still, it's good to include him because you need someone to do that job. Next up, Motorized Bounty Hunter. I can't remember if my opponent took the Red Fury one or one of the other ones, but it's not that important one way or the other. The point is that these guys are a bike, they are cheap, they are a fast attack piece, and it's something that O12 in particular really wants. Moving on to what I have classified as Group 2, although please be aware that these groupings are completely made up. We have a Lynx Specialist Operative with Plasma Carbine and Assault Pistol. I think these profiles are really good on paper. They are able to run out and push buttons. They're able to stay in hidden deployment, which keeps them safe. And if your strategy is to defend well and then wait till later turns in the game and run out with a hidden deployment specialist, the Lynx is a good option for that. However, 29 points is a lot of points to spend, and as we can see, my opponent was really only able to put one of them in there. Next up are two Kita Flash Pulse bots. Not much to say there. They're just cheerleaders Flash Pulse bots. Basically everyone gets them except Tohaa, and they do their job. After that is the Lawkeeper. I think this guy is absolutely auto-include for O12 in a mission like this, and I think it's because he does basically everything that you need him to do. In O12, you need a fast attack pace, and guess what? This guy is a mimetic Red Fury on a bike. He's fast, and he can attack. In Neural Net, you also need to have Specialist Operatives, and this profile is a Specialist Operative and therefore can run around and push buttons. Lastly, fast attack pieces often are vulnerable to things like mines, and this guy has a side bot which can both run around and trip mines, and then also can threaten to template things with that heavy riot stopper in order to do an awful fort. So, Lawkeeper, I think he's a really good profile. I see why he has been included here. I don't know if this guy is all that and more. I mean, if memory serves, the Montesa Knight in military orders is approximately the same cost and comes with a whole extra wound. but I certainly can understand why my opponent chose to take the Lawkeeper in this case. That said, the Lawkeeper is a lot of points, and he is a single wound model that is very vulnerable to all of my Ferroware. Being only one wound, if he gets a whiff of endgame, he could be done, and if he gets hit by a Racer, he's isolated and nothing else is going to be successful. This guy is really easy for Tohaa to shut down, and unfortunately, I am playing Tohaa. After that, two straightforward pieces. The Alpha Lieutenant is a good pick. Lieutenant with an extra command token, and Strategos, 24 points. The fact that he's on an S4 base is kind of annoying, but he can go prone. He's decent enough in close combat to protect himself, and I don't think that he is as bad being S4 as some other S4s that you might have. And then, of course, there is a Warcore who's just doing Warcore things. So that wraps up discussions of my opponent's list. Let's take a look at mine. This is, again, an experimental list. It was strongly informed by the game that I played against Radic. In that game, I desperately wanted to take a Triad and go out with lots of orders and do a bunch of damage, but I simply didn't have enough orders to actually accomplish that thing. So here I am experimenting with having an active Lieutenant who can go out and do things, and I'm also experimenting with having a real Triad in Group 2 who can throw smoke to help the advance of the Group 1 Triad. The hope is that this extra smoke can alleviate some of the burden of smoking up that the Tackle would otherwise have to do. All that aside, it is a pretty typical Tohaa list, hence the name. You have Jan Star, who, everybody in Tohaa is going to take. You have a Triad consisting of a Tackle Lieutenant with +1 order and a Spitfire, a Sakiel Paramedic, and a McCall. The only thing that's interesting here is that I chose the Lieutenant +1 order profile, and frankly, I probably would not be doing that again in the future. We then have a middle Triad of a Kael'tar and 2 McCalls. I think in practice I might have put 2 Kael'tar and 1 McCall in there, but the basic idea is you've got these Kael'tar who are bringing the bombs and the mates, and they make good link filler, so why not throw McCalls in there so you can have an extra source of burst to Heavy Flamethrower in ARO, or burst to Eclipse Smoke. And then we have the Drawl. The Drawl was the answer to my concerns last game of how bad the Tackle was at shooting. In that game, I had a Tackle Spitfire who spent a whole ton of orders shooting at a Tanko missile launcher. It was really dangerous. I could have lost the face-to-face and lost the game. And it was really inefficient because I'm only BS13 and I've only got a Spitfire. My thinking, therefore, was the Drawl with his AP Marksman Rifle and his Mimetism -6 would be able to take those gunfights and advance up the field and feel good about winning in that fashion. In practice, while the Drawl is perfectly serviceable as a gunfighter, he really is sort of only like a 1-wound gunfighter. As soon as he takes a wound, he loses his Mimetism -6 and therefore loses his ability to take active gunfights. And not only that, the AP Marksman Rifle simply isn't that great as a gun. No one's going to tell you that it's a bad gun, but if you're really crutching on it as being able to destroy things in the active turn, it just isn't all that and more, even with an extra burst from the link, even with Mimetism -6. I do like other parts of the kit that the Drawl is bringing. His shock mines are going to be very effective at, causing Liang Kai grief. The fact that he's 6'2" means that I can move 6 inches and drop a mine, and of course he is a specialist operative, which means he can push buttons. And in the context of Neural Net, I actually believe that I chose this list precisely because the Drawl was yet another specialist. The other list that I was running in this event didn't have nearly as many specialists, and I was worried that if I had to go second, maybe I lose 1 or 2 of those specialists, and I'm significantly limited for the rest of the game. Didn't turn out to be an issue, but the Drawl being a specialist is nice. Then in Group 2, we have the Diplomatic Delegate. This is the Tohaa Warcore, who, for the paltry cost of 2 points, becomes a specialist operative, gets CC attack -3, gets a nanopulsar, and also gets a eraser program. This dude is absolutely busted, broken good. CB, I'm gonna take him as long as you keep giving him to me, but my god, he's good. Paired with him is the Liberto, who, honestly, it's saying a lot about the Diplomatic Delegate, but I think the Liberto is less busted than the Diplomatic Delegate, and the Liberto is super busted. He's a very nice include here. I will say that the 1 SWC that he costs really does hurt when I'm spending so much of my SWC on people like Jan Star. I really would like to have another gun. Finally, we have the 3rd attack Triad. This Triad is identical to the Triad in the first one, except the Tackle has Chain of Command instead of the Lieutenant +1 order. They are able to go out there and shoot, they are able to go out there and Ferroware endgame people, and this is important, the McCall is able to use those Group 2 orders in order to throw smoke to support my Group 1. That is the intended use on paper. In practice, I don't think I ever used my Group 2 orders in order to throw smoke for Group 1. It just didn't work out that way. Whoops. Even so, it's a rock-solid triad, and I would happily recommend it to people who are interested in trying out Tohaa. And yeah, that's my list. It's a very straightforward Tohaa list. The only thing that I'm experimenting with is having the Lieutenant with the +1 order and having the Tackable Triad in Group 2 in order to support that, with the intent being that I will use all those extra orders to fuel Alpha Strengths. In this mission, I don't need to do any of that, but it is the theory of this list, and that is something that I think is important. Okay, list's done. Let's talk about deployment. I don't remember if I won the lieutenant role or my opponent did, but I definitely got to go first, and that's a big deal. Getting to go first, I wanted to deploy in such a fashion that I could attack my opponent, or I could push buttons if I needed to. To that end, here is what I did. In the center, I put a Drawl and 2 McCalls. They would be able to both push this button here in the center, and also then advance in order to push the button that's actually in the full middle of the table. In that process, if my opponent leaves anything out for me to gunfight, I will be able to gunfight it with the Drawl, and if there isn't anything to gunfight, I can put some mines down, and then I can tuck the Drawl with his Symbio Bomb and Symbio Mate into one of these corners, maybe here or something like that, where he'll be really hard to see, but he'll be able to delete things with Endgame or some other Fairware tactics as they run by. All told, this is a good use of the Drawl. I think it's good on paper, and it does play out in practice. Switching to the color blue here, I had my Lieutenant Triad over there. They are in a somewhat defensive position. The McCall is edge guarding, the Sakiel in back is watching for drop troops and watching kind of narrow-ish lines of fire, like maybe that way. And of course the Tackable is here to drop Fairware on anything that tries to come through this way. What I found is that I very rarely actually use this triad on turn 1 because Jan Star is in Group 1 and I just want to use all my orders on Jan Star, so they're trying to be in a defensive position. Picking up the pace, I have a triad of spares here in the middle, 2 Kael'tar and a McCall, just providing burst and then spare members. And then off to the side, I have my Group 2 triad. I wanted to keep the Sakiel safe for button pushing. The Tackable up here is trying to be able to Fairware anything that gets close, and the McCall is just edge guarding. You'll recall that when I built the list, I wanted these guys to throw smoke in order to cover the advance of other members of Group 1. However, because they're off to the side, they are not going to be throwing smoke for anyone. That has been a common theme when running this list, that the Group 2 Triad tends to get deployed off to the side. I don't know if this is just how I deploy or if there's a broader theme here, but throwing smoke using Group 2 orders has not been working out for me. You can't see him, but there is a Tohaa diplomatic delegate here. My plan is to use Group 2 orders to run up and push this button, then run over here and push this button, and if I get extra lucky, I'll be able to go prone here. And I believe I do get extra lucky, and it all works out well for me. Reinforcing that defense is the Liberto, and then my withheld piece is Jan Star way over here. This is my opponent's deployment. He chose to withhold, I believe, the Gamma and the Lawkeeper. So everything else went down was Liang Kai and Gangbuster. Gangbuster that has been flipped over just because we wanted to see where his base was. This is the Motorized Bounty Hunter. This is the Alpha unit. I believe he was supposed to be prone, not standing. Warcore definitely is standing. Flashball Spot, Varangian. I personally do think these Gangbusters are fairly exposed. And as you can see, I definitely have simply dropped Jan Star here for the sole purpose of murdering this Gangbuster, and in that fashion, taking out one of his specialists. But Gangbusters lacking that camouflage that we talked about earlier means that I think they're always going to be exposed unless you have some really nice buildings to drop them into. The only other two things are that there is a Lynx multi-sniper in hidden deployment there, and the Lynx specialist operative is in hidden deployment, I think, right there. So yeah, all told, my opponent has adopted a very defensive position. In my opinion, this is, of course, a really good strategy. It is a good way of stopping yourself from getting alpha struck. However, it does give me the ability to seize control of the board, push a lot of buttons, and then stuff my annoying Fairware guys into all these corners. And that is exactly what I end up doing. So I didn't take a lot of pictures on turn 1. The best I have is pictures during my turn 2, but this is good enough for me to talk about what happens. Looking at the board, I recognize that Liang Kai is the most threatening attack piece, and that my opponent does not really have all that many specialists out there in order to run out and push buttons, so I want to try to kill them. I also noticed that Jan Star is rather shut down by templates. I could have put him somewhere else, but I figured this was a fairly safe use. Thus, my priority is for Jan Star to be able to kill the Gangbuster without triggering the Mad Trap and thereby losing his mate. To that end, I am going to use the Drawl to try to push some buttons, then run up in this direction trigger the Mad Trap, which is right there, use the draw's extra good dodge +3 to successfully dodge the Mad Trap, then maybe be in a position to push this button and, figure it out from there. All that does more or less happen in practice. There are only a few hiccups. First, the draw fails his dodge. No big deal. He does have a mate himself, so he isn't, stuck in place, but it does kind of stink to lose the mate in that fashion. Moreover, my opponent does accidentally reveal his hidden deployment sniper. He does so when the draw is standing, I think, right here, where line of fire to the draw is blocked by this pillar. I let my opponent put the guy back in hidden deployment, but from that moment on, I knew where he was. And so he wasn't going to surprise me. Anyway, I spent a bunch of orders on the draw running around, and then I switched to group 2. I took this diplomatic delegate, ran out here, pushed this button, ran over here, and successfully dodged over this lip. Otherwise, I would have eaten a flash pulse from the war core and maybe a gunshot from someone else. I don't remember, but I successfully dodged over the lip into total cover and then crawled over here and pushed that button. I only had 5 orders with this diplomatic delegate, and I had a lot of stuff that needed to get done. And she passed every single roll she needed to. That's 2 button pushes and the dodge. I bring this up because it highlights the fact that the concentration skill doesn't actually get rid of luck. It simply means that the question becomes, did you get lucky when you were making your rolls instead of did you get unlucky when you were making your rolls? I had a handful of orders left after this. I think I put down mines with Jan Star because mines really make Lian Kai sad. And then I drew the draw back to this position where he could watch the stairs up here, and also put down mines again to make Lian Kai sad. That was my turn. I don't think I killed much of anything, but I did actually manage to push this button, and I think this button was the one that was encrypted, but I passed the whip roll, so I learned about that, and then I pushed this button. 3 buttons pushed, 1 more discovered. Altogether, a really great turn, really solid defensive position. My opponent, looking at this whole situation, looking at Jan Star, who has put down a mine and who has gotten a mate and a bomb, but otherwise really hasn't done all that much, he's thinking, gosh, I've got to kill Jan Star because if I let him start turn 2, Jan Star is going to just go murder everything. I think he might have been right about that, I'm not sure, but killing Jan Star is going to be a production. First things first, this Varangian goes up. The problem that he runs into is that as soon as he gets over the stairs, the draw will see from that position. I do want to give a shout out to my opponent here. The line of fire was very narrow, and this was very easily something that we could have had some really tense conversations about. But there weren't tense conversations. He was an absolute gentleman, and I really like playing against Estugon because that's always been my experience playing with him. But there was a really narrow line of fire in order to see the stairs. I had intended for there to be a line of fire to see the stairs. That's sort of why I put the draw where I put him, but it wasn't obvious to see. As a result, the Varangians are going to have to either dodge or just eat free arrows as they come across the top of this thing. And so what he decides to do is he does send the Varangian over the top, and then he templates Jan Star. Jan Star is able to either survive the templates or maybe he loses his mate. I don't recall exactly, but the Varangian does end up completely dying in this process. However, the mine has been cleared out. Next up, my opponent sends in Lian Kai, again because of the stuff that's on arrow and watching. For example, I think I did stand up this Takawel, so it was watching. Because of all the stuff that's watching, Lian Kai can't actually get over there terribly efficiently. As a result, it is probably 3 or 4 orders before he has gotten to this position, and he can't simply super jump up to here, or else, again, he's going to get shot for free from the draw. He doesn't want to get shot for free from the draw, he wants to survive, so he has to spend those orders, and then he does jump up over the top, and having jumped up over the top, he goes into normal CC with Jan Star. Lian Kai is CC 23 with martial arts level 4. Jan Star is CC 20 with CC attack -3. This means that Jan Star is on a 17, Lian Kai is on a 23. However, it's only burst 1 versus burst 1. Jan Star does win the face-to-face with his viral pistol. Lian Kai fails one of the saves and is shocked off the table. This basically took a ton of my opponent's orders, and it resulted in very little. Jan Star was still there, still alive, and I think he even still had a Symbio Bomb. He won't do anything for the rest of the game, but he has killed Lian Kai, which is by far much more important than anything else. My opponent does then spend a handful more orders on his Red Fury Specialist. He runs up this way. I think he successfully pushes this button, and remember there's a Tohaa Diplomatic Delegate up there, so he ends up sending his side bot all the way up there in order to try to glue gun or otherwise eliminate the diplomatic delegate that's up there. I believe what happens is the diplomatic delegate nanopulsers the side bot and then survives the glue template in some capacity or another. So all of that basically leaves this poor biker pretty stranded up there without actually accomplishing anything. And this concludes turn 1. In my opinion, from this point on, the game is pretty much over. By killing Liang Kai and also killing a Varangian and also, losing that side bot, I have successfully eliminated the primary threats that he can bring to my Tohaa presence, while also getting a huge advantage both in board control and in number of buttons pushed. Yes, my opponent still has a lot of pieces. Yes, my opponent still has a lot of orders. Yes, there's a lot of things that could go wrong here, but all I have to do is play it safe, play it careful, and keep my eye on the prize of these button pushes, and I'm going to be fine. That is exactly what I end up doing, and, it does pretty much mean that the battle report could stop here. Still, we can take a look at this picture, which I think is at the end of my turn 2, and it will give us a sense of what happened. Basically, I take my Liberto, who is starting here, I run the Liberto around to this position, killing the Lawkeeper here, and also, I think he is hiding from the Gangbuster. I'm not sure if he actually killed the Gangbuster, but he does kill the Lawkeeper. That's with Group 2 orders. And with Group 1 orders, I take the Lieutenant Triad and I run it over here, and I am able to push this button and push this button. And I believe I Pharaohware delete a Varangian or something like that. But ultimately, it's just about pushing these buttons. It is in this context that I did actually use the concentration skill. I believe the Sakiel Paramedic failed both times on the first roll, but I just left him in silhouette contact. I moved up, left him in silhouette contact, and when I failed the roll, I just did the concentration thing. I didn't need to be extra efficient and keep moving. I might have been able to push this extra button had I taken a risk on failing the die roll again and, moved my Sakiel and the rest of the team 4 inches away. But why? It's just about pushing these buttons. So instead of using this concentration skill to offset bad luck on the third turn of the game, I am instead using the concentration skill during the middle of the game in a very, very boring capacity where I'm probably going to pass it, but I don't actually need to do anything else with my orders, so why take that dumb risk? Did this reduce the inherent possibility for bad luck? Sure. But it's not a case where that reduction in bad luck makes the game any more interesting. In fact, it makes it less interesting because I have less ability to actually run out and try to do stuff. Anyway, that does pretty much wrap up my second turn. I have pushed yet more buttons and killed yet more of his crucial pieces. We're getting close to where I want to stop this battle report, but I'll go a little bit further forward. And the reason is because it highlights how strong Tohaa is on defense. I have left a whole ton of my dudes in the midfield. And in a lot of other circumstances, those dudes stuck in the midfield would kind of be targets for my opponent to attack. I mean, imagine if I were playing, let's say, Panoceania, and instead of leaving a bunch of tackables in the midfield, I were instead leaving Vargs or Bolts or whatever. Those dudes would absolutely be fodder for whatever short-range fast attack pieces that my opponent had brought. And the trade-off of leaving my guys more exposed in the midfield, but also not having to spend orders to retreat them, that trade-off is interesting and it makes the game interactive. But I'm not playing, that fictional Pano setting. I am instead playing Tohaa. And these Pharaohware guys are just going to sit there and prevent any of my opponent's wound-based troopers from actually coming up and hurting me. In particular, there's a bunch of Varangians over here. They more or less can do nothing because they don't have stealth, and I can either isolate them or put them dogged and kill them. Likewise, my opponent has a motorized bounty hunter over here. That's a nice fast attack piece with a Red Fury, and it can do absolutely nothing because of this Tohaa diplomatic delegate that will isolate him long before he gets a chance to get close. And because pretty much all of his fast attack pieces are unable to get near me, I don't have to leave anyone on ARO. So because no one's on ARO, this Gamma is not really in a position where he can use that phenomenal HMG +1 burst to do anything. All of which is to say, despite the fact that my opponent has almost all of his SWC still on the table, it is largely useless because of the Pharaohware. Of course, part of the reason why we're in this circumstance is because I have engineered it to be so. Leaving my guys in the midfield would be way more reckless if I couldn't fall back on Pharaohware to defend them. But on the other hand, it really does skew things because of all the wound-based pieces my opponent has brought. And while we're talking about wound-based pieces, yes, my opponent could have brought the Beta Trooper, but remember that almost everybody who has Pharaohware can also drop Mirror Ball. So that beta trooper's going to spend, what, 2-3 orders walking up? I'm going to drop Mirror Ball. It's Eclipse Smoke. He can't see anything. He can't see me because he's a beta trooper, and he's still just wasted all those orders. Yeah, sure, he's not dead because he's got structure, but neither was he able to actually accomplish a very effective attack. Dropping Mirror Ball is way less aggressive of a defense than Endgame, but it's still quite effective, and it still shuts the opponent down pretty well. And it is in the context of all that discussion that what my opponent does, instead of using all of his SWC guns that are still alive, is take this Gangbuster, put him in marker state, and run all the way up here so that he can try and take out this Tohaa diplomatic delegate. In the process, he does manage to kill the Liberto. I forget exactly how, but he gets up there, he guns down the diplomatic delegate with his SMG, and fails his save against the nanopulsar and goes unconscious. So after all that, the Gangbuster is really not even able to push the button, and that's my opponent's turn 2. Turn 3 is really just a rinse and repeat of turn 2. I run around and push a bunch of buttons. I could use the concentration skill to push those buttons, but as it would happen, my guy fails none of his whip rolls, so I don't have to. I push this button, and then set up in a defensive position. Likewise, I believe I take this triad and just move it, I don't know, over here or maybe over here or something in order to be more in the way. My opponent is then left with a fair number of orders. I mean, he doesn't have that many orders left, but the problem is he's only got one specialist, and all of the consoles that he would like to push buttons on are covered by Fairware Tactics. So the specialist is a hidden deployment links. He's got to run all the way over here. Once he gets there, he is able to push that button, but he is essentially out of orders by the time he gets there. Which brings us to the end of the game. It was a pretty resounding victory for Tohaa. I think the score was, 7-1 or something like that? But what that score doesn't capture is just how disgustingly Tohaa and a little bit of luck absolutely dominated the entirety of this game. I was able to push buttons and then hunker down in almost complete safety without having to really worry all that much about my opponent coming and getting at me. Really, the only piece that my opponent had that was marginally threatening to my tackles was Liang Kai, and as we've discussed, he died to Janstar. And as I read to this part of the battle report, I actually seem to recall that Janstar probably had his mate still by the time that the Liang Kai had shown up, and because he still had his mate, that means that Liang Kai would have actually had to win the face-to-face twice in a row in order to put Janstar unconscious. So yeah, maybe even Liang Kai against Janstar is not a good pick, I don't know. But what I certainly can say is that the Tohaa nonsense basically absolutely dominated this game in a way that, I don't know, I don't mind making 1 or 2 battle reports about it, but has been highly representative of the games that I've been playing. So often my games are either I defend really well with Tohaa Fairware or I attack really well with Tohaa Fairware against opponents that are either inexperienced or, in the case of Estugon, who is quite experienced, simply does not have the tools in order to handle it. On the other hand, I'm not really doing a heck of a lot of stuff that I feel good about either. I'm simply pushing buttons and hunkering down and being extra really defensive. I'm not doing any of the, grand heroic charges that I used to like doing in Steel Phalanx. And it's particularly alarming in the context of the next mission, which is Decapitation. In Decapitation, there's a whole lot of reasons why you need to be able to get out of your deployment zone and attack the other guy and do damage, and I'm very worried that my Tohaa aren't going to be able to do that. They didn't do that in this game. I mostly stayed on my half and pushed buttons. I think I am therefore justifiably worried about my ability to attack in the next game. But you'll have to wait till then in order to see how that goes. So thanks for watching this time, and I'll see you around.